Historical events that we learn about through textbooks and lectures are often sanitized versions of the past, but some of them have failed to make the cut for school curriculums. Number 10. In some places around the world, evolution is taught in schools and colleges. Some of them make mention of the 8 other human species that existed, but what they fail to detail is where those 8 others have gone. The list starts with Homo luzonensis, which is believed to have inhabited the Indonesia region. The Homo naledi remains a mystery but resided in South Africa. No tools or other animals were found with them. Neanderthals were muscular and had larger brains than we do today. The Homo floresiensis were a tropical species of short stature with a height of 3 feet and 6 inches. H. heidelbergensis was characterized as the hunter. The rudolfensis species were discovered in Kenya and are believed to also exhibit a larger brain. Homo erectus was said to be an enduring hiker that was able to stand fully erect. We then came to the handyman, the Homo habilis, before ultimately ending up with our species, Homo sapiens. Over the course of many centuries, each of the species had walked the earth, but now there remains only one. The question persists: what happened to our distant cousins? Some of these species, such as the floresiensis and luzonensis, had lived alongside H. naledi in South Africa, but sometime around 10,000 years ago, they all mysteriously disappeared in something of a mass extinction. Mysteriously, no visible evidence exists of an environmental catastrophe. There were no records of a volcanic eruption, drastic climate change, or an asteroid impact. It may have come as a shock, but it turned out that it was our fault. There's been evidence in the timing of the extinction that the spread of a newer species set off a 6th mass extinction, the Homo sapiens. The mass extinction was a 40,000-year event that went from the disappearance of Ice Age animals to the destruction of the rainforest today. As the last human species to emerge, we're likely a uniquely dangerous one. Throughout history, the early hunter-gatherers were described as peaceful or noble, and the violence grew from culture, not nature. But field studies and archaeology suggest otherwise. The primitive cultures were intense and often rather lethal. Discoveries have found the use of weapons such as clubs and spears, with the addition of guerrilla tactics, including ambushes, all of which had a devastating effect. Remains of these 8 prehistoric beings reveal violence between humankind. There's documentation and evidence of massacres that happened during these times, and it's not likely that any of the other species were more peaceful. The sophistication of weaponry during the evolution of Homo sapiens placed us at an advantage over our ancestors or cousins. That being said, cave paintings and carvings illustrated that we have had an advantage in communication as well, and DNA testing reveals that some people in Europe have Neanderthal DNA. People from East Asia, Polynesia, and Australia seem to have traces of the Denisovan species. It appears that we didn't replace the other species, but our ancestors bred with them. This is further proof that the 8 different kinds of humans had vanished after encountering us. Our numbers grew exponentially and were left unchecked. Every 25 years, our numbers doubled, and once we evolved to become hunters, we had no predators left. Without predation, populations grew even more, exploiting all available resources, leading to food shortages, drought, and overharvesting. This, of course, led other communities and tribes to wander into different territories for food, causing conflict in the form of raids and defense. While we may have eradicated 8 other human species, it wasn't a planned or purposeful thing. It was simply a means of survival led by pure chaos. The fact that we once lived alongside these other species makes one think of what life may have been like if they'd survived. Keep in mind, all of this is basically just an idea or a theory at this point. Nothing has really been proven as of yet. But if all that's been said is true, well, it's certainly one creepy historical mystery. Number 9. The history books tell us of the events between 1939 and 1945, the Second World War. We know of the countries that took part in it, as well as key individuals. Some significant events took place during this time, such as the Battle of Crete and the invasion of Poland. Aside from all the atrocities, there was another deception that we'd never heard about: the Ghost Army. On the 20th of January in 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops went mobile. They were the first multimedia tactical deception unit in the United States Army history. There were 82 authorized officers and 1,023 men that were under the control of Colonel Harry L. Reeder. The unit had saved thousands of Americans' lives and earned the country's highest civilian honors. Their weapon was pure deceit. They combated the war using inflatable tanks and vehicles. They'd used false radio traffic, sound effects, and phony generals. They used acts of imagination and illusion to push back against the enemy, saving many along the way. Both the Ghost Army and the 3,133rd Signal Service Company, Europe, were liberated from the grips of tyranny. They engaged in 22 large deceptions in Europe, all the way from Normandy to the Rhine River. The bulk of the team arrived in England in May that year. Colonel Billy Harris and Major Ralph Ingersoll had conjured up the operation. Both were based in London, and they carefully selected a unit consisting of artists, engineers, soldiers, and draftees. Artists included a fashion designer named Bill Blass, a painter named Ellsworth Kelly, and Art Kane, the photographer. West Point graduates and Army Specialized Training Program members had been recruited for the Ghost Army, and it was said that this army was one of the highest Army IQs, at an average of 119. Their artillery didn't fire, the tanks couldn't move, and the unit would prefer to wield paintbrushes rather than weaponry. They managed to create various ruses to fool the forces that acted against them. The sounds they blasted across town included the rumbling of tanks, shouting troops, and even the voices of sergeants ordering their men to put their cigarettes out. Through this deception, the army lured the Germans away from the Belgian town of Bastogne amidst the Battle of Bulge. In 1949, they pulled off another hoax during Operation Viersen. The 9th Army was making preparations to cross the Rhine River. To divert the Germans, the Ghost Army inflated 600 dummies around their own size, where they would impersonate 40,000 troops in 2 separate divisions. They again used a fake radio chatter that spread false reports to make the enemy believe that the infantry were amassing. The team added fake division numbers and insignias onto their vehicles, and even put up pretend headquarters and command posts. They sewed fake patches to their uniforms and loudly discussed fabricated intelligence in the local bars, ensuring that the German spies would hear the disinformation and spread it. The ruse was a success. After the war, the soldiers were sworn to secrecy and the records were classified. They packed up all the equipment they'd used to fool the war. Other newspaper articles surfaced, but after that, no one spoke publicly about the deception again until 1985. The knowledge of the special unit became public, and it wasn't until the mid-1990s that the knowledge of the Ghost Army was officially declassified. Number 8. Generally, history classes consist of the teachings of the First and Second World Wars and even the Civil War. Seldom do they go into much detail about ancient Egypt. But this piece does not center around the pyramids, the Nile, or alien hieroglyphics, but rather a very strange and eccentric individual. Pepi II was born from Pepi I, late in his father's reign. He was still young when he succeeded his brother, Merenra, becoming the 5th king of the Old Kingdom, 6th dynasty, which served from 2305 to 2118 BC. One thing about Pepi was that he absolutely despised flies, although some sources say that he was downright afraid of them. To combat the intrusion of these insects, he would coat his slaves in honey, using them as living, breathing fly traps. This would attract the flies to the honey coatings and away from the pharaoh himself. But not all the ancient Egyptians saw the swift creatures as a nuisance, but rather as a symbol of persistence, and so they became held in high esteem. Golden flies were often given to soldiers who displayed greatness on the battlefield, and amulets of the flies were also made from various elements, including silver, lapis lazuli, and amethyst. Some of the best flies were found in the tomb of Queen Ahuhatapa. Wearing these creations was also thought to ward off insect bites, which seemed a lot less cruel than coating a follower in honey. This was not the only ludicrous behavior that the pharaoh was known for. According to a preserved letter to Harkuf, the governor of Asman, Pepe had requested that a dancing pygmy be captured politely and brought back to him to entertain the court, the emphasis being on politely. The letter was a response to one that Pepe had received from Kharkov, who'd come down from Yam with an army and brought along many gifts. The pharaoh asked him about a pygmy that dances that he'd brought from the place he'd come from. He asked if Kharkov would bring the man along with him, alive and sound, and rejoiced so that he could entertain them. He also detailed that at night, when the pygmy slept, others would sleep beside him to make sure that he was safe, and he would be inspected 10 times each night, all because he desperately desired to see the dancer. Pepe II is said to have been one of the longest reigning kings, with some sources indicating that he ruled for 94 years and others saying 64. During his reign, Egypt was facing some hardships, including crop failure and famine, but there's evidence that the power and wealth were increasing. The pharaoh was also referred to as Pepe II Neferkare, and is perhaps the king that's being spoken of in the tale of King Neferkare and General Susnet. The tale recounts the secret meetings between the pharaoh and one of his generals, but the story exists in fragments, and its meaning is subject to debate. Number 7. For the 12 years of school, we've never been taught about any UFO events or other strange aerial phenomena that may have taken place. So it doesn't come as much of a shock that no one learned of this case that happened in 1953. Felix Eugene Moncla Jr., or Gene, was a United States Air Force pilot and the main character in the Kinross incident. The ordeal was named after the Kinross Air Force Base, where Gene was placed on a temporary assignment. It was also during this event that he would mysteriously disappear. Near the US-Canadian border, the Air Defense Command had noticed a blip on the radar where a blip shouldn't have been. It was an unidentified object flying in a restricted airspace above Lake Superior, a short distance from Sulaks, which is the Great Lakes' most vital gateway. Upon noticing this, an F-89C Scorpion jet from the Truax Air Force Base took off. The base is near the Kinross AFB, and the jet, along with 2 crew members, were sent to investigate the blip. On board was Moncla, who had clocked 811 flying hours, 121 of them of which had been in similar aircraft. Second Lieutenant Robert Wilson observed the radar during the flight, but neither man would return from this intercept mission, and it was recorded as one of the strangest UFO cases in history. When the pair were airborne, Wilson had trouble tracking the object because it kept changing course. Ground control began giving the directions, and so the pilot gave chase. The jet pursued the unidentified object for a good 30 minutes and began catching up. Moncla had been guided down to 7,000 feet as the radar operator watched the dot chase the other across the screen. 70 miles off of Keweenaw Point, the Scorpion had caught up to the unknown object. It was at this point that both of the dots on the radar screen merged into each other. After this, according to the official report, the radar returned from Moncla's plane disappeared from ground control interception station scope. The other blip, though, did return, which meant that it had vanished and appeared again. Another 2 F-89Cs were deployed, hoping to catch up to the pilot and try to raise Moncla on the radio. A whole 40 minutes later, one of the other pilots and the radio operator heard a short transmission. It was Moncla's voice, but there was no communication after that. 3 teams, including the United States Air Force, the Canadian Air Force, and the United States Coast Guard, embarked on an extensive search, but no wreckage, no pilot, and no debris were ever recovered. The news release about the event spoke of the merging in Upper Michigan, and the Chicago Tribune headlined their article as "Jet, 2 aboard, vanishes over Lake Superior." But there was a twist. The Air Force changed their story. They retracted their statement and instead explained that the ground control operator had misread the scope and that the Scorpion had successfully carried out the mission, identifying the UFO as a Royal Canadian Air Force C-47 that had been flying 30 miles off course. Canadian officials, though, denied that this happened and claimed that no flights had taken place that evening in the area. It's been just over 70 years since this incident occurred, and we're no closer to having any answers as to what happened that night or where the pilots and the aircraft had disappeared. Number 6. Out of all the greatest inventors in history, the textbooks leave out one who was way ahead of his time. Heron of Alexandria flourished during 62 AD in Alexandria, Egypt, where he took a creative career of being a Greek geometer and an inventor. His writings showed a great knowledge of mathematics and engineering of Babylonia, the Greco-Roman world, and ancient Egypt. Heron's most important work of geometry, Metrica, was lost until 1896. While his mathematical advancements were rather important to modern-day life, it's in his inventive side that the focus is today. Robots sound like a future endeavor that opens a whole world of possibilities, but the first one was invented during the time of Heron. When one hears the word robot, one may think of C-3PO or WALL-E, but the automation here was something more like from Westworld, another television series. If you've ever watched it, you'd know of the creepy robot-like creations that were being used for entertainment. This is precisely what the inventor had created. The invention itself was rather simple but still creepy. It was made using a simple statue placed on a platform, which was moved using lead weights, 3 wheels, an axle, rope, and pins. The weights had been the source of the power. When they fell down a tube, they pulled a rope that was wrapped around the axle, which would spin. The pins on the axle allowed the winding of the rope to alter direction, allowing the axle to spin in another direction. This caused the robot to turn and move during the entertaining show. But there's something strange about this creation that you wouldn't expect. It was programmable, not in the way of coding, but rather the rope was wrapped around the prop's axle. Changing the direction of the winding, where it ran, and how often it would do this, changed how the robot behaved. This mechanism was said to be very similar to the modern binary computer language. This form of programming would allow the prop to carry out various actions, and by the time the weight reached the ground, the robot would stop. This was the first example of automation that's popular in today's society. The creations were used to entertain the community in theaters or on stages. They're described as being the historical version of Westworld and likely took on a creepy appearance. Additionally, Heron also invented the vending machine. A device would supply holy water when a coin was inserted into a slot. The coin would drop into a tray that was connected to a crank. The crank would open a valve that allowed water out, and when the coin slid off, the lever snapped back into place, waiting for the next customer. One of his more well-known inventions was the steam engine. It was a bladeless radial turbine that would spin when the water in the center was heated. A cupric stand was placed on a boiler using 2 vertical pipes. He also created automated doors using free energy and the elements. Heron was the hero of his period, even though he made some creepy robots and he paved the way for math, physics, geometry, and engineering. Number 5. Speaking of great inventors, creepy automation, and people being ahead of their time, Thomas Edison made a talking doll, and as you can imagine, it probably wasn't the best children's toy. Before the talking doll, though, the great inventor had created the phonograph, which came about in 1877. He imagined various uses for his new creation and what it could possibly be integrated with, and that's when he came up with the idea that it could be used to animate children's toys. It had a ceramic head and a creepy metallic body with some wooden limbs attached to it. Within the torso, a tiny phonograph was placed, bearing a brown wax record that recites one of the well-known rhymes that could be sung to youngsters. The scariest of the dolls, which were featured in wonderful condition, featured the lullaby, "Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep." Turning the crank inside the metal body allowed the record to play. The talking dolls were born in 1888, weighing 4 pounds. It took 4 months for the dolls to be manufactured, but slowly but surely, they began to be released to the public, featuring more rhymes like Jack and Jill and Mary Had a Little Lamb. There were as many as 18 women working in the factory, reciting the songs into the machines. One of the newspaper headlines read, "Wonderful toys which Mr. Edison is making for nice little girls," swiftly changed to "flat, uninflected wine." According to the record, the dolls were a failure, and at least 7,500 of them were produced, with a bit more than 2,000 of them actually selling. The dolls were scaring children, and probably adults too, not to mention the fragility of the wax records, which would become damaged during shipping. For this reason, the dolls were only produced for 6 weeks. Later, the recordings were removed and the dolls would be sold as regular puppets. There had been some surviving ones that were collected by the Thomas Edison Historical Park. This said that the recordings sounded far better back during their production, but even the brand new, unplayed ones seemed to emit something unnatural and haunting. The dolls have been described as the stuff of nightmares. 2 of these recordings became available to hear online in 2011 and were covered by Buzz60. But since then, the collection has expanded to 8 recordings. The world's first talking dolls were incredibly creepy and traumatizing, to say the least. Number 4. In 1977, the president hosted the Shah and his wife at the White House. But this sparked a large protest. From 1978 to 1979, the Iranian Revolution was at play. It had been this event that would topple the United States-backed system of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. The Canadian ambassador, Ken Taylor, along with his embassy staff, quickly planned to evacuate 850 Canadian workers from Iran. After this, they would process many applications for visas from Iranian citizens who were rather anxious to leave. During this time, militants stormed the embassy and took 66 Americans hostage, 14 of which were later released. 6 Americans, who were United States Department employees, managed to avoid capture but were unable to leave the country due to the ongoing hostage situation. They took refuge in the homes of embassy officers. Major operations were planned to address the crisis, one of which was known as the Canadian Caper. A scheme was developed by a team of CIA and documentation falsification specialists, with the goal being to exfiltrate those 6 Canadians. The mastermind had been Tony Mendez, a CIA officer who'd specialized in covert operations. The scheme was absolutely daunting, since none of the 6 of them had any intelligence background. The plan required thorough coordination with the US and the Canadian government. If it failed, it would be a threat to the safety of the hostages and would place the US and Canada at risk of embarrassment. Significant problems for the plan were overcoming the strict immigration exit controls in Iran, and there had to be a credible cover story with supporting documentations for them. Tony's plan was strange and so exotic that it would likely not draw any attention. The plan involved a fake Hollywood movie. Together with the CIA and an experienced motion picture consultant, they managed to set up a fake company that they called Studio 6 Productions. The company titled their upcoming movie Argo, with a Middle Eastern sci-fi theme that had Islam at its center. The storyline was intentionally made difficult to decipher, and the ads proclaimed that it would be a cosmic conflagration written by Teresa Harris. Teresa Harris was an alias that one of the 6 Americans had chosen while waiting exfiltration. The rescue operation was quickly approved by Jimmy Carter, who was president at the time. So the crew was prepped for their new movie production, along with their forged documents and disguised packages. They scouted for a suitable location to fake their film. Before their departure, the 6 Americans rehearsed their stories and their roles in the movie's production. They wore Hollywood disguises and slowly made their way through the airport, which was chaotic and clogged. They chose an early morning flight to increase the chances of the officials being too sleepy, and the Revolutionary Guards being in bed. On the 28th of January in 1980, the 6 were being escorted by a CIA member who posed as the production manager. The Americans wandered around in gift shops, acting as regular tourists. They got through customs and immigration without raising any alarms, but their hopes of freedom were suddenly squashed. There was a delay in the flight, and other flights began to arrive. Tony grew nervous, but learned that it was just a small mechanical delay. Soon, the fake crew safely got on board, and the flight was ready to leave. There was a sigh of relief when the aircraft cleared Iranian airspace. The scheme was an outstanding victory, and Studio 6 could now fold. The public was entirely unaware that the CIA had played a role in the most successful operation, which was outlandish and definitely risky. Number 3. For quite some time, historians have been trying to uncover the identity of Agent 355, who was a key member in George Washington's Culper spy ring. It began in 1776, when the president became eager to know more about the British troops and their plans. And so he sent in Nathan Hale, a brave but terrible spy. He was caught by the troops while trying to return to his regiment. After this, the president would have to conjure up a new plan, which is where the successful Culper ring came into play. This network was able to give Washington some intel on British planes to counterfeit American money. So Congress recalled currency that would have been devalued otherwise. They also informed him of the plans that the British were executing an attack on French forces, and even ruined Benedict Arnold's plan to turn over the West Point fort to the British. The spies within the ring gathered intelligence from behind the British lines, but were concerned about their identities being exposed, so they referred to one another by code names and numbers. Most of them only knew one or two of the other members, which paints a picture of how secretive it was. First, there was number 721, who was Major Benjamin Talmadge. He was in charge of the operation and was the only one to direct report to Washington himself. He took on the name John Bolton. Abraham Woodhull acted as a businessman who had to take various business trips to Manhattan. He was referred to as Samuel Culper Sr. in 722. Robert Townsend took the part as a partner in a coffee shop that was popular with the British officers. He was named Samuel Culper Jr. with the code number 723. While others have been identified, one of the agents' identities remains a mystery. Woodhull mentioned this individual in a letter to Talmadge. Talmadge had been concerned that the British counterintelligence had learned of the spy ring, but he was assured by Woodhull, who said the following in his letter, saying, quote, "By the assistance of 355 of my acquaintance, we would outwit them all." According to the codebook, 355 refers to a lady, but just which lady that was has stumped historians. The mysterious agent has been widely regarded as the woman who played an important role in the colonial army's victory. This spy had allegedly used a very complex cipher system to transmit codes. It's thought that she resided in New York, where she was in contact with Benedict Arnold. Evidence suggests that she'd exposed Arnold as a traitor, which led to the arrest of Major John Andre, who was found guilty of aiding Arnold. Others think that she'd been involved with the British loyalist family, giving her access to the commanders. After the conviction of Andre, the British had a few suspects that they thought might have provided the information about the man to the colonial personnel. Documents have detailed that Agent 355 was arrested, but refused to give up any information about the spy ring, her activities, or even her name. She was taken aboard the HMS Jersey that was stationed at the New York harbor. The vessel was notorious for the ill living conditions on board. While it's not confirmed, it's thought that she may have met her demise on the HMS, but her legacy lived on. Some think that Agent 355 was the partner of Townsend, but still this is just speculation, and not much is known about her life or even who she was. During this time, there was a woman named Anna Strong, who lived on Strong's Neck, Long Island. She made use of her laundry line to send codes. If she hung clothes in a certain way, it would indicate that information for Woodhull was ready to be picked up. Some believe that she was 355, but it's disputed that she was ever aboard the vessel. Her identity was never truly identified, and her story remains a persistent mystery. Lady is often referred to as the American Revolution's most mysterious spy. Number 2. Ever wonder where the term "mad as a hatter" came from? It was popularized in Lewis Carroll's 1865 novel Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. The term mostly refers to an eccentric character known as Hatter, who's paired with the word mad. This term is often used to describe an unpredictable person, but it didn't originate with the author, but rather during the 18th and 19th centuries in the hat-making industry. During the hat-making process, hatters would make use of mercury nitrate, a really toxic substance. It was used to turn animal fur into felt, which was used to make the hats. During this time, workplace safety was quite obviously not a concern. The rooms were not well ventilated, and prolonged exposure to the toxin caused a variety of both physical and mental ailments. This would include tremors that were referred to then as Hatter's shakes, although in Connecticut, the tremors were called the Danbury shakes. It would also cause speech problems, emotional instability, and even hallucinations. Headaches, weakness, and behavioral changes were among the common symptoms. Increased salivation, insomnia, leg paralysis, muscle atrophy, and memory struggles were among the recorded symptoms. The disease would become known as Hatter disease or Mad Hatter syndrome. The neurological effects that resulted became known as erethism. In the early 1940s, mercury was banned from the production of felt hats in the United States. In 1865, John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln. The assassin was later assassinated by Boston Corbett. Corbett worked in the hat industry when he was younger, before serving in the Union Army. The day that Booth was tracked down and surrounded by the soldiers, Corbett disobeyed orders and fatally wounded the assassin. It's believed that he was under the effects in terms of behavioral changes due to mercury poisoning. He later continued his work in the hat-making industry and moved to Kansas, where he would live out a solitary existence. In 1887, though, he ended up in an asylum from which he would escape and disappear. And that's only one of the many historical accounts of those inflicted with ailments caused by mercury. It's believed that the Mad Hatter that Carroll wrote about was actually based on a real-life person who had the disease. Theo Carter, a furniture dealer, was said to wear a hat all the time and was referred to as the Mad Hatter by locals. Carter was known for peculiar inventions like the alarm clock bed that dumped the sleeper onto the floor. He also exhibited some rather rude behavior. Another possible contender may have been Samuel Ogden, a hatter from Manchester. At the time, he was known as Mad Sam due to his bizarre behavior and mad habits. As mad as a hatter was more than just a metaphor. Victorian-age hat makers were indeed facing some neurological problems and no one knew why. It was all attributed to mercury, a neurotoxin. The symptoms of exposure were only identified in the 1950s. Sir Isaac Newton and Blaise Pascal were among the famous scientists who also suffered from this sort of poisoning. The stories of the hatters serve as a cautionary tale against the hazards of chemical exposure. Number 1. Aconite, wolfsbane, and monkshood all refer to one extremely dangerous and toxic plant. There are over 200 species, and they're sometimes cultivated as ornamental flowers, but they're extremely toxic when consumed. If ingested, they can cause hypotension, chest pain, bradycardia, and abdominal pain, and can be fatal. This is why it was used against the Crusaders themselves during the time of the Crusades. During the 14th century, in the reign of King Philip VI of France, there existed yet another great inventor and Italian physician named Guido da Vigevano. Based on his writings, we learned that he was a rather colorful figure in aspects of medieval technology. He's been cited as the first to have conceived the idea of an automobile, but this seems to evade history books. Guido worked closely with the king and provided him with all kinds of information during the Crusade era. He designed 2 self-propelled wagons, the forerunners of the automobile and the tank, but it would not be these inventions that he would become known for. Guido was rather remembered for his invention of the creepy and gross slug soup. It wasn't some sort of delicacy, but rather an antidote. Aconite was widely weaponized at the time, and its roots contained aconitum alkaloids. One day, he'd taken note of some slugs that were eating aconite leaves. This observation would lead him to conclude that the slugs must have a way to tolerate the toxin, which meant that there must be a cure for the poisoning. So the inventor grabbed a whole bunch of slugs and boiled them. The resulting concoction was first tested on animals, and he was satisfied with the results. The brave man then intentionally poisoned himself with aconite before slurping up his sluggy soup. It was a success. He became sick 3 times after that, but soon he began to feel a whole lot better. It wasn't the slugs themselves, though, that cured the poisonous effects. It was the secretions from their bottom end that did. The slug was from the genus Limax and contained a compound called limacin, which was found to have neutralizing properties. The entirety of this process is not yet understood, but it's believed that the limacin binds to the aconite, which prevents it from interacting with the body, ultimately reducing the side effects. Of course, this method was only used when nothing else was available. Nowadays, luckily, there are other means of treating such a poison, including high doses of magnesium sulfate. Slug soup is no longer among the requirements for fighting against the toxin. Guido's discovery was used by many different cultures throughout various eras for quite some time. He didn't know it at the time, but he had paved the way to securing a means of antidotes for poisoning and probably saved countless lives, even if it consisted of a slippery meal. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.